ourselves in the spirit of things. We lose our sight when we put our trust in things of this material world, of things that fade away. Let me keep coming back, 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 keep coming back.
Alright, let's get it going. So today's video will be on lift. Let me go down farther. There we go. And we're going to make this as conveniently short as possible. I know one time I did a video, it went for about 6 hours, so let's try not to do that this time. Here we go. Alright, lift. Start off with the fundamentals here. What is lift? Well, it's a force. Professor Shady B, that is right. That is right. The professor is in the house. Thanks for tuning in to our Rainbow Six game, by the way, the other day. We didn't win that one, unfortunately. That was sad, but it was a fun game. That was a fun game. How you been? How's the life in quarantine been going for you? So here we have lift as a force, and we'll say it's caused by pressure differences. Now we'll know this pressure difference to be called a pressure gradient. This is the common name used for it. You're doing great. Very good, very good. You're going to have a test on all of this, by the way, 2 days from now. 56-page essay, single space, Times New Roman, font size 9. Okay. Let's get right back into it. Alright, so we got force, we got, it's caused by pressure differences. It's what makes things fly. In the world of aerospace. And it's what keeps things on the ground. In automotives. Oh, by the way, when you write your essay for the test, you only get 1 second to do it all. Or else you fail. Everything. You'll never get a job. You'll fail school as it is that you've gone through so far. Just everything. Your high school diploma will be stripped from you. You're going to lose it all. This is also what moves things forward. When it comes down to engines. It's what generates power. For things like windmills. It is also correlated to drag. Almost forgot how to spell there for a second. Alright, so that's what we got here so far for what lift is. It's a force, it's caused by pressure differences, and when we talk about our simple planes flying, it's what makes them fly. Yeah, you got your plane, right? Whee! Lift makes it go up. Simple. Oh, I don't have anything out. I was gonna pull out a model car, but don't have one of those. But in automotives, when you have things like spoilers, that's what keeps things down. When you have things like cars, you hear about like sports cars, supercars having flat bottoms, and they're lowered to the ground when they go into a sport mode or a super mode. That is also to keep it on the ground. For engines, when you have a propeller spinning or a rotor on a helicopter spinning, it generates lift in order to create thrust. For windmills, as wind goes through a propeller, the generated lift causes it to rotate, turning a shaft, and that shaft generates power that is then used for cities or other uses of power. I don't know what people use power for nowadays. But this is what drag is, and yeah. Or drag. Ooh. Off. Great start. Alright, this is what force is. God. This is what lift is. Alright, let's move on before I mess it up again. Alright. So, first off, we're going to go ahead and take a little look here at... Where's that? Here we go. So lift we talked about as a force. And this is our common picture that we have here when we talk about lift. Lift is the upward force, thrust is the forward force, weight is the downward force, and drag is the backwards force. This picture is actually wrong. So, am I allowed to draw this? Can I draw? No, I can't draw. Come on, let me draw. God darn it. Whatever. Alright, so. Let's take a look at this. Alright, here we go. Now we can draw. So, the only one in this picture that is correct right now is weight. And the reason why is, bring this bad boy down like that. Weight will always be pointing towards your body of gravitation. So, assuming that this is Earth, it always points toward Earth. So weight is always pointing down toward Earth here. Now, here, we can see that its propellers are currently facing this direction right here, which means that the body's velocity, we'll call it VB, is currently in this direction. And because of that, its thrust isn't actually forward. And this is essentially an issue. Thrust is usually generalized to be your forward force, but thrust is a force of propulsion. That's all thrust is. It is a force due to propulsion. So if you're going in this direction, your thrust is also in this direction. So this is where thrust should be. Your lift is based on the airflow. So if the airflow is like this, we'll call it V infinity, which stands for the free stream velocity of the air. In other words, if we're going to call this the body frame. Let's take a look at this. We're just going to call this the body frame. And what this body frame means is that we're looking at this body being our aircraft, and we're just going to say that the aircraft is always standing perfectly still relative to us, and the only thing that's moving in this picture is the air that flows from the right to the left. So, that air that's moving right to left is called V infinity, and if it has a vector that looks just like this, nice and straight, nice and horizontal, then the lift force is indeed directly up. But if I were to say that our velocity of the air was like this, our lift would actually be in this direction. And the reason why is because lift is a force caused by pressure differences, or caused by a pressure gradient, that is normal, which means perpendicular, to the flow of air. To the flow of the medium is what we'll call it. In this case, for general purposes, air. So that's what lift is. Lift is a force caused by a pressure gradient that is normal or perpendicular to the flow of the medium, which in our case is air. So we go back to this, right? Let's say we have our V infinity again. Actually, I'm just going to keep doing it over here. So, if we have some vector like this is V infinity. This vector here, which is at 90 degrees, will be your lift force. If I have a vector that looks like this, this is our lift. So that's how lift works. And so because of that, a better picture than this one is this one right here, which shows our plane. It's at an angle. The thrust is upwards, because that is the direction in which it is facing. The lift is at a slight angle, which means that the flow of the air is also at an angle. Specifically, our engines here are creating thrust in this direction. There's your thrust force. Now, simultaneously, what this is saying is that the plane has been flying at this vector for quite a while now, and so the velocity of the air is also in the opposite direction. And because of that, our lift force, right, if we keep this line going like this, our lift force is going to be nice and perpendicular. So there's our lift. And then drag, which we'll talk about next week, or on Thursday, is in the same direction as your flow. And then down here is Earth. Here's the ground. And so our weight is going to be toward Earth. So that's lift. The general consensus of lift. Okay. Let's go and move on. So now that we know what lift is, we can talk about being specific to us in terms of aerodynamics with planes and rockets. Whenever we have a lifting body, that's the first thing we always learn about. We'll get to things like the fuselage and stuff like that later. But when we talk about our lifting bodies, we usually talk about a wing. And when we have some plane, with our bubble top canopy right here. Oh, also, never make a plane with the canopy at the very, very tip of the nose. That's... Unless you plan that out very well, it's not the greatest idea. But anyway, so what we have here is some plane. It has a wing. It has some horizontal and vertical stabilizer as well. And this wing, which comes all the way on out like this, there we go. this wing, if we were to cut it, or if you just look at its root chord, right here, this is what we call the root. Here's what we call the tip. And at all sections, the root, the tip, or just anywhere inside, right? So let's just say we cut a piece of the wing out and just looked at it. Let me make it somewhat similar to the rest of the plane's airfoil. There we go. This is what we call the airfoil. What's up, Tristan? Okay. You know, Tristan, I could do that. There's math to do that. It's not hard. But, here we are. And this is what an airfoil is. And what we're going to do now to talk about lift is we're going to just look at some general airfoils. So let's get right into the action here. Ladies and gentlemen, airfoils. What is this music that's playing right now? Alright, so we talked about our lift as forces. We're going to go ahead and talk about some airfoils now. So, hopefully this is large enough for everyone to see, but what we got right here are some airfoils. We have some low speed ones. So your typical ones you see are like your low speed ones. The Dolphin Flipper, which is a symmetrical airfoil. We'll talk about these things soon. I just want to show some pictures. This airliner airfoil right here is what's called a transonic airfoil. Its specific name is called a supercritical airfoil. This right here, a supersonic interceptor airfoil. This is for planes that move at supersonic speeds. And Tristan, god damn it. But this specific one here is called a biconvex. We'll get to that. The Blackbird is a helicopter. It's a very small helicopter. It's also a bird here. Oh, I'm sorry. I always get them mixed up. I always mix up Blackbird and the Little Bird. I was thinking about this, so now I just look dumb. Stop giving me pictures of actual birds. Here we go. This is what I was thinking about. This is the Little Bird helicopter right here. I believe they're no longer in service. I think only Spec Ops might be using these now. But this Blackbird here is actually referring to the actual bird. And the reason why it's so highly curved, we call this a curve. I'm getting the name of it. Give me a second as I think preposterously on the name of a curve. The camber. There we go. And imagine I do this a lot. Alright, so this is the camber. When it curves, it's called the camber. And the reason why airfoils like this curve so much is to create more lift. So, on a Blackbird, which are, you know, a little bird, in fact, a lot of birds have high cambers, so they can generate a lot of lift. Also, they have to eat a lot, because it takes a lot of energy to generate flight for birds. Here's a turbine blade, again, highly cambered to create a lot of lift generation to push air forward toward the back of the engine. Dragonfly wing. Biology is very special and very cool. So helicopter blades and plane wings are a lot of this very much similar. For helicopters, unlike a plane, so planes have very small amounts of, and I'll go ahead and show this real quick, just before we get into this. So when you have a propeller, or we'll start with the plane, right? Your typical wing usually has some airfoil, and it stays relatively straight. That's typically how we learn it. However, what we actually find out is that this isn't necessarily the case. and that it looks something a little more like this, where toward the tip of the wing, it'll have actually twisted a little bit so that the airfoil at the bottom of the wing has a slight angle. So just going to draw a red line here. And it actually has this angle, alpha, called an angle of attack. Whereas over here, it has its own angle as well, called alpha. So toward the bottom, it will dip down. And that's for reasons of generating lift, preventing stall, and stuff like that. And that's more a design element. For helicopters, we'll just call them Helos. We'll find that the blades have a much higher twist angle. So it'll be like something like this. And the reason for that is because... Sorry. I'm not the greatest at drawing, but here we go. Its twist angle here will actually be greater. So we'll just call this delta alpha for a helicopter is greater than the twist angle of that of a wing. This isn't actually how you represent twist angle. And then for like propellers, that twist is even larger. In fact, usually when you see a propeller, it'll just look something like this. Be straight, and then like it gets nice and large toward the tips. And the reason for that is because if you look at it from the side, something like this, and then as you get toward the end, it'll look something like this. We'll use green to show the tip. So you can see that complete difference of angle. Oops, sorry. So it'll look something like that. And so props have a huge delta A compared to that of a wing. Hopefully that answers your question there, Tristan. But they are all essentially wings. Just their twists are changed more and more depending on your application. Alright, let's get right back to airfoils. So first we're going to talk about this kind of airfoil. So this airfoil right here is what is called symmetrical. In other words, if I drew a line through the center of it, it is the same on both sides. And that's something we're going to talk about here in a second. Then we have a different kind of airfoil. We'll make it look something like this. We'll just give it a flat bottom. This is called asymmetrical. Because if we were to draw a line through the center of it, it is not the same. And then another kind of asymmetrical airfoil is one that has camber to it. Yes. So this would be the front of the propeller right here, Tristan. And if you were to look at it directly from the side, this is what it would look like. That's correct. I'll be right back. There's something I must do. Now, while this is like a presentation on lift, I do not do any streams that are formal. I always do all my streams informal because I just love talking. So chat, feel free to say whatever kind of crap you want to say. But Andy did hit me with the orange juice time, so we got it. Let's get it. Alright. No ice cream today, Sean. No ice cream today. Now you're gonna get scanned. Andy, I did it the last time you did it as well. Also, everyone, make sure you have water. If you don't hydrate, you will die. And that's also part of aerodynamics. I did, Andy. You just didn't see it. Alright, let's go ahead and get right back into it. So, in the camber line, we're looking at it like this. So let's kind of talk about these three kinds of airfoils in relation to lift. First, we'll start with symmetrical. Did you alt F forward my stream? I was fucking with you, dude. Get played, nerd. Alright. So, symmetrical airfoil. At 0 degrees angle of attack. So, in other words, if we have this airfoil right here, and we were to say that the velocity is going directly at our airfoil, what happens is that it'll create a pressure difference on the top that'll look something like this, right? Just an assumption on the top, but on the bottom, we'll make it green, it'll have a pressure distribution that is the same, and because of that, the pressure here will cancel out the pressure on the bottom. And we will find out that at 0 angle of attack, you generate 0 lift. Gonna add an M to that? It's spelled wrong, isn't it? But that's fine. That just shows uniqueness. It's fine. It's fine. Oh, I almost made the Italian flag here. Pretty sure it's the Italian flag. Anyway, so at 0 degrees, angle of attack, a symmetrical airfoil does not generate lift. Now, at an angle of attack that is greater than 0 degrees, it creates positive lift. At an angle of attack that is less than 0 degrees, it creates negative lift. Now we'll get into pressure gradients here shortly. But I wanted to go over that and we'll retouch on those things soon. Alright, so that's what you need to know about a symmetrical airfoil. Next up, asymmetrical. You like that, Tristan? You like that for some uniqueness? Sean complains about how bad you're... Well, that's because it is, Sean. Alright? If you can't speak... I get to do this because I am entitled to my opinions. Anyway, back to it. Asymmetrical. And the asymmetrical airfoil, at a 0 degree of angle of attack, can have lift. In fact, it will have lift. So, going to take our asymmetrical airfoil here. What happens here is that we get our pressure gradient on top. And then we can get some really, really small pressure gradient on the bottom here. This is a flat bottom too. So what we find out is that because of this, we will generate lift. Let me try and make that straight because we're at 0 angle of attack. Now, probably wondering what exactly do these terms mean, and again, we'll get to that shortly. I just want to get the main concepts of these out of the way. At an angle of attack greater than 0, we will generate lift. At an angle of attack less than 0, we will still generate lift. Now, I'm going to make this more specific. We're going to assume that our asymmetrical airfoil looks like this, so that it's curved on the top and not on the bottom, because we want to deal with, airplanes. So it'd be odd if we started looking at the opposite, which is what you would use for like spoilers on a car. Shut up, Sean. I'll kick you off the team. I'll kick you out of Rocket Project. I'll give you an... I won't say the last one. But I'll make your test harder at AE123. How about that? Anyway, here we go. So we're going to look at this in a specific kind of airfoil where it's curved on the top and not on the bottom. Or in other words, has more curve on the top. So, at 0 degrees angle of attack, we're going to have a positive lift. At an angle of attack more than 0, we're going to have a positive lift. And then, at an angle of attack less than 0, you have a positive lift. For a very small angle of attack under 0. For the sake of this, we'll just say that's usually between 0 is more than or equal to angle of attack, which is more than or equal to -2 degrees. Afterwards, it's a negative lift. Alright, and I don't know if that's how it works, right? I like to follow through with my stuff. Just like how I got orange juice for you, Andy. You kept bringing it up, and I got some OJ. Look at that. So yeah, this is pretty much like 0 degrees. At some point, as it goes into the negative angle, for this specific one, we'll just say it's -2. That'll be its theoretical 0 degrees, or its zero lift angle is what we'll call it. After scamming you 4 times, look, Andy, I kept telling you, I warned you, brother. So that's where we're at for asymmetrical airfoils. So let's go ahead and move on. To cambered airfoils. Now, a cambered airfoil can be symmetrical or asymmetrical, but for the sake of this, I'm going to look at asymmetrical ones. Okay, so we have asymmetrical cambered airfoils here. And trying too hard, Sean. I felt like I was playing Xbox again, making that word. Alright, so cambered airfoils, again, we talked about having this curvature here. So we're going to look at this specific kind of cambered asymmetrical airfoil. And what we got here is at 0 degrees angle of attack, we generate a positive lift. Here's why. we get this really large. I need to bring this down. Get this really large pressure gradient on the top and a pressure gradient that kind of diminishes actually on the bottom. Really cool, really cool. And this cambered airfoil generates a whole lot of lift. Cambered airfoils generate the most amounts of lift per se. Yes. It says absolutely. Answer is 1 calorie. So, John? Absolutely, hit me with that question. I'm here for all kinds of questions. You can ask me things about Disneyland if you wanted to. If arrangement as internal, external, or temporal content is a highly relative term, and everything is part of one structure, which is essentially based on energy, what is actually space? Space can be based on the repulsive and attractive force of the same or opposite charge. I'll tell you exactly what space is. Space, by definition, is the first term, a reference frame, defined by one or more dimensions. That is your definition of space. So, if I drew a line, if I drew my number line like back in elementary school, just went from 0 to 20 and named it, this is a space in 1D. If I add a line up, or if I draw an airfoil, that is in 2D. I can give it a X direction and a Y direction. This is space. If I make a wing, we now have a Z direction. We are now in 3D. When we go into AI learning, you can go into an infinite amount of dimensions. So you do not have to worry about that. So that is the definition of space. Alright, back to the cambered airfoils. So at 0 angle of attack, we have a positive lift. At an angle of attack that is more than 0, we get positive lift. And then at an angle of attack less than 0, we get positive lift. I'm sorry, we get a positive lift. Again, following the same thing as up here. In fact, let me go ahead and just do this. Easy. Boom. So all the same stuff still happening here. Alright, so now we've looked at these airfoils. We've gone through the main parts of them. Symmetrical, asymmetrical, cambered airfoils. Tell Denzel he said hi. Okay. I won't have it. I won't have it. I'm never going to say that to that man. Alright. Now we're just going to take a look at different kinds of airfoils real quick. So, subsonically, we use airfoils that are blunted on the front. So airfoils that look like this. We had our symmetric airfoil. And then you also get some that are cambered as well. Okay. Austin passes about -2 degrees. So it changes based on your airfoil, and that stuff has to be calculated. I'm just using -2 here as an example. But, does lift factors just directly change? No, it still follows the lift slope. And that's something we'll get to. We'll talk about lift slope here in a moment. Okay, so subsonic, we have airfoils that look like this. They are typically blunted, or in other words, high leading edge curvature. And that's one of the big things. If we go to transonic, so a lot of your regular airplanes that you see in an airliner use a transonic airfoil nowadays, and we call these ones specifically supercritical. And a supercritical airfoil looks something like this. It's fairly flat on the top. It's not actually flat, it's still curved, but it's decently flat on the top. And then on the bottom, also decently flat, but then you get this camber toward the back. And the supercritical airfoil was created by somebody named Whitman. I'm forgetting his first name, but his last name is Whitman. And then we'll also take a look at our supersonic airfoils. And in supersonic, we have a few different kinds we'll talk about. The biconvex. Don't worry about the word modified yet, we'll get there. And then we also have the double wedge. Alright. Cool. And the biconvex looks something like this. It is a symmetrical airfoil. It's essentially just two curves on the top and bottom. The double wedge is straight lines, also symmetrical. Alright, so we have supersonic, transonic, and subsonic. So, we're going to come back around to these, but first, we're going to talk about those pressure gradient things I was talking about. So, let's talk about the pressure gradient. What is the pressure gradient? This is a very confusing thing. And the pressure gradient is, if we have an airfoil, we're going to make our airfoil nice and flat. Oh god. I cannot do this. Fuck it. It just ends right there. That's where it ends. Don't do it, don't do it. Fuck, I did it. Alright. I'm just gonna draw a brand new airfoil. There we go. So we have an airfoil. And I showed you a picture that looked like this. And then I also added a green area. So what these are, these areas, is that these areas are pressure distributions. So one thing that we know is that whenever you have something, there's going to be a pressure applied, right? So like, we as people, we live in one atmosphere. We don't acknowledge that we're being pressured by the air around us, but the air around us is pressing against us, and that pressure creates a pressure distribution. My orange juice, all the orange juice in here is creating a pressure outwards, and the farther down it goes, actually, the more pressure it applies, just because of the weight sitting upon it. Same thing with Earth. The pressure of air actually decreases the higher you go into the atmosphere. But we have a pressure distribution, and this pressure distribution always acts normal or perpendicular to the airfoil. So, let me start drawing some arrows here real quick. Right, you get the idea now. Just draw some more lines real quick. I was going to draw straight lines here. Boop, boop, boop. There we go. And on the bottom, same thing. We have pressure that acts normal to the airfoil. Now, here's where things get spooky and different. This high amount you see up here is not actually the pressure on the top of the airfoil. And the green is not actually the pressure on the bottom of the airfoil. This is vice versa. So this red is actually the pressure from the bottom of the airfoil pushing upward. This is why I redrew it, because I didn't mean to draw arrows. I just can't help myself whenever I draw straight lines to make arrows. Alright, and then on the bottom, much the same, arrows is in the opposite direction. Now, remember, this is pressure from the lower surface of the airfoil, and this is pressure from the upper surface of the airfoil. For those of you who end up going to AE301 and AE302, it's very important you understand that they will also be denoted the same way. PL is pressure on the lower side, PU is the pressure on the upper side. Now the reason why I drew it like this instead of the other way is because typically when you see an airfoil, it will be drawn out such that it looks something like this. And the reason why it looks like this is because this is the net resultant. And the net resultant is called the pressure gradient. The pressure gradient is the difference between the top and bottom the top and bottom of the airfoil. So that's what it looks like here. This is lift. So when we draw it here, it looks something like this. And what happens is that this pressure gradient tells us that if we were to average all of these vectors, all these forces across the airfoil, at some point we would find a point along the airfoil where we can average all the forces and say, hey, our lift is going to look something like this. And that's what lift is. Earlier I was saying that lift is caused by pressure distributions or the pressure gradient. And that's what this is. So if you're wondering now, why exactly does pressure generate lift? All I've said so far is that there's a difference in that if I said, for example, PU, we'll say PU is equal to 5 kilonewtons for some reason. And that's going to be pushing down, so we'll make it negative. And then we'll say that the top force, or the force to the bottom of the airfoil, is only equal to about 8 kilonewtons. We get a pressure gradient of 3 kilonewtons, which is also going to equal 3 kilonewtons of lift. So that's how pressure works. And the reason why this happens is because if we had, say we have some people here. So we got some people here. I'm just going to make a little boundary. Alright, this little boundary right here, this blue wall. Now we're going to pretend that this wall here is actually our airfoil, for the sake of it. Now we're going to say that there's maybe 2 people over here. Now this group of people over here, they hate being near each other. Now, they can see through this wall, okay? That's just something they have. They have X-ray vision, so we're going to go ahead and give them X-ray vision. And when they look across this wall, they say, hey, there's only 2 people over here. I want to go over there because there's less people, which means I won't be so freaking crowded all the time. And so what they're going to decide to do is say, hey, I'm going to try and go through this wall over to here where there's less people. Over here, they're happy not being crowded. Yes, we are kind of doing chemistry now, yeah. And the reason for this is that, again, they just hate being near each other, so they want to go over to a place where there's less people. Because when people are all near each other, now you have people pushing each other. It's like New York City before Corona hit, you know? Or even worse, Tokyo. I would have said Mexico City, but Mexico City isn't as large as it once was. It used to be the largest city in the world at one point, but now it's Tokyo. R.I.P. Mexico City's title. Anyway, people are all bumping into each other, and they don't want that anymore. They want to be in a place where people aren't bumping into each other. You know, everyone has their elbow room, their personal bubbles, their space. So they're going to try and go through this wall. But as we all know, if you try and just walk through a wall, you're going to fail miserably. And so what happens is that as we have, how many people? We have 8 people here, right? So we're going to have 8 people. All right, we're going to call that P. Are pushing against this wall. Because they're trying to get through this wall to the other side. But these 2 people are over here are like, I like not being crowded. So they're going to push back. There's only 2 of them, right? Now everyone here is equal, all right? Everyone's equal in my eyes here, and if they're all of equal strength, well, these 2 people are going to get decimated. And what's going to happen is that a total force of 6 people is going to make it through, because 2 people are going to get canceled out by these 2 people, and now this 6 people is going to push this wall, and this wall will start to move. So now, if we were to look at it on a vertical scale, right, we would find out that this is called lift. This is exactly how lift works. And it just so happens to be that people is also the same letter for pressure. I'm so good at this. Alright, let's go ahead and move on. So that's the pressure gradient. And that's how that works. Now, as your angle of attack changes, like this, right? Let's say we have an airfoil that's now at a high angle of attack. What we find is that our pressure gradient does something that looks like this. And the reason why is because at a certain pressure gradient. For a lot of airfoils, it usually happens around an angle of attack of 12 to 20, depending on your airfoil. It can be lower than that. It can definitely be lower than this. But this is a usual for a lot if you just want to make a guess. 12 to 20 degrees. And what happens here is we start getting something called an inverse pressure gradient. And the inverse pressure gradient means that suddenly our pressure is going in the opposite direction of what we want. And what happens is that our lift might have looked like this at angle of attack equals 0. And then suddenly our lift looks something like this at, say, 6 degrees. And then we're just going to say it's like this at maybe 10 degrees. And then we start to find out that we have a lift that looks like this at, we'll say 14 degrees. And what we find out here is that this lift means that the airplane is now stalling. This wing is no longer generating lift to push you up, and if you're not generating lift to go up, you're stalling. So LA equals 10, we see that it has no lift up or down. This would be an angle of 0 lift. The point after angle of 0 lift, where the lift becomes negative, is your stalling point. So, in aerodynamics, we actually have a graph. Looks something like this. I'll go ahead and spell it right this time. For a symmetrical airfoil, we'll find that this is our angle of attack. And this is our lift slope. Or, not our lift slope, but our lift. And we usually use the coefficient of lift for this, instead of an actual lift number. Because it's, this way we can apply it to numerous different kinds of airfoils of the same type. Now for a symmetrical airfoil, we find that at 0 degrees angle of attack, and this is 0, our coefficient of lift is 0, because we talked about before, symmetrical airfoil at 0 angle of attack does not generate lift. And that's because if we go back to this, PL and PU will be the same. The pressure on top and the pressure on bottom will be exactly the same. Now, what happens is that as our angle of attack goes, essentially it should be a straight line. Looks like this. Now, what we actually find out is that this is only theoretical. And at some point, we find that our actual lift will hit that stall point. And our lift curve will actually look something like this. Now, Byron, it's still essentially creating lift at this point. Well, yes, But the reason why it's called stall is because at this point you need the airfoil to be generating a certain amount of lift that it is no longer creating. It'll actually become a stall. So we're going to go ahead and tack on to our stall definition. There we go. So now we know that stall is the lift becoming negative relative to the lift needed to counter weight and drag. Now, similarly, this will happen the same thing on this end as well. It'll actually start to go like this. Now, if we take a look at a asymmetric lift slope, we'll find out that here's our alpha, here's our coefficient of lift, and we'll find out that we can be negative at 0. And then we have our lift curve again. There we go. So this is what an asymmetric airfoil looks like. Now, as we talked about before, because of the camber, we have this area between here and here that is an angle of attack less than 0. Now, the slope of this line is what's called A, which equals the lift slope. Which, as we know, lift slope is a rise over run. So, that would just be your coefficient of lift over change in alpha. Pretty simple. And from a whole bunch of theory and proven analysis, the lift slope is linear for the majority of its part until it gets toward its pressure gradient inversion. Now, we're going to go ahead and hit our first equation of the night, or day. Depends on when you watch this. It could be yesternight. We find out that the coefficient of lift is equal to your lifting force over QS. Now, Q is what we call the dynamic pressure. And that is equal to 1/2 rho U squared. We find that rho is our density, U is our velocity. We find S to be our reference area. And our reference area in this case is the area of the wing, so the entire area of the wing. So, using that, we can rewrite our coefficient of lift as 2 times your lift divided by the density of the air and the speed of the air squared. Now, in straight and level flight, we can rewrite our coefficient of lift as 2 times the weight of the plane times rho U squared. Similarly, we can rewrite these as our velocity equals the square root of 2L rho CL, or, in the case of this, U equals the root 2/8 over rho CL. So that's how to go between velocity or coefficient of lift, and that is how those are implemented. So those are our first equations of the night. These are very important equations to know. Regardless of whether or not you do aerodynamics, very important just to know these equations. Alright. Let's go ahead and move on. Alright, so we covered the pressure gradient, we talked about the lift slope. And we covered this. So now we're going to talk a little more about the pressure gradient and why exactly it works. And to do that, we're going to talk about something called Bernoulli's equation. Now, we know Bernoulli's equation simply written as this. This is our second equation of the night. It's going to be the pressure force, or pressure energy, it's an energy in this case, plus our dynamic energy, or the dynamic pressure, which is 1/2 rho u squared, plus our potential energy, which is going to be G H. Is usually written out as this, GZ instead of GH. Z is to represent our relative height, so we'll go and write Z a little nicer there. There we go, Z. And this equals a constant. In other words, no matter how you change this, it's going to equal a constant number. Now, what we tend to do for the sake of aerospace is that we divide rho out of this equation, and we get pressure over density plus 1/2 our velocity squared plus GZ is equal to a constant. And then, since we're dealing with airflows that are usually at the same relative height, GZ is equal on the same side, so we just subtract GZ, and we get P over rho plus 1/2 U squared equals C, being our constant. The only time we use Z is, let's say we have a pipe flow. So here's some pipe. This line right here is the center of the pipe. The only time we would use GZ is in this scenario, because this right here is going to be Z1, and this right here is going to be Z2. We don't really deal with this in aerodynamics, so we just cancel this part out. However, if we did have to include it in aerodynamics, we would. Okay, so this is Bernoulli's equation. And what it tells us is that on our airfoil, what happens is that the flow as it goes over the top of the airfoil speeds up in velocity. This is something we know. And so the velocity here speeds up. The velocity on the bottom also speeds up. However, it should be noted that the change of the velocity here is greater than the change of the velocity on the bottom. So what this means is that as this velocity goes up in this equation, in order for this to be constant, our pressure must go down. Our density of the air is going to remain the same. So when this happens, our pressure goes down, the more velocity goes up. So if the velocity goes up more on the top, the pressure on the top is going to be lower than that on the bottom. And as we talked about before, that creates that pressure gradient that allows us to generate lift. Now, density isn't always going to remain the same. Now, let me just write. Therefore, the change of just doing this in colors. Come on, there we go. On the upper surface, it's going to be more than the change of the pressure on the bottom surface. Therefore, lift is generated. Okay. So I move on. Rho stays constant under Mach equals 0.3, because this is what's called incompressible flow. And in incompressible flow, the density isn't changing, therefore it's not compressing, and because of that, we're able to use Bernoulli's equation. But once we leave compressible flow, so we go over Mach 0.3, we start going to different things. Bernoulli's equation doesn't really work anymore. And we start using different equations for that stuff. But things still stay relatively fair. Okay. So that's Bernoulli's equation. Simple as that. But now we're going to talk about why the velocity speeds up. In case it's been a little weird on why I'm doing things backwards in terms of explaining, because essentially what we're doing here is we're taking lift and we're reverse engineering it. So you're taking what you know is lift and breaking it back down into its basic fundamentals. So now we're going to talk about something called the Coanda Effect. And the Coanda Effect is why the velocity speeds up. Now, what the Coanda Effect says is that if we have some object that has a curvature to it, like this, we're going to find out that as the air flows over it, it's going to turn. We know this. We know that air turns with the airfoil. Now, what happens is, and the reason why this happens is because you imagine the air hitting off. It's going to create vectors called streamlines that look something like this. And they're going to be tangent to the surface. And the reason why the air gets turned around is because as this airfoil curves, it leaves essentially an empty space. So let's take another look at something else here. Let's say we have this wall. And this wall is going to have a ramp that looks like this. Now we're going to say that the air is flowing over the ramp nicely and smoothly. Or in fact, we're going to forget about the ramp. We can just talk about the air on the top of this. So we have some air that's flowing over the top of this. Now as this air flows over, there's this void, essentially. It's not a true void, it's a pseudo void. And it's going to look something like this if we had to draw it. in the space. And what's happening is that all this air that is going around here is realizing that, hey, there's this region of very, very low density. A few people are over in here. Just 2 people again. And there's going to be a whole bunch of air up here. And that air is going to be like, hey, I want to move downward. So that air is going to push this flow downward into this slight gap. Now, the least occupied this gap is, the stronger of a suction force is going to have. And that's the Coanda Effect. Now, this suction force can be greater implemented by having a greater curve. In order to have a greater curve, the more something curves, so if I have a small curve like this, small curve, the airflow is going to curve, essentially, if we were to make like Riemann sums out of this, as you can see, the majority of the curve happens about right in here. So the velocity is actually going to speed up the most right here, as it speeds up a whole lot right there in the front. As the curve starts to go back towards 0, the velocity at which it increases is also going to reduce. Let's go and write that. If we're looking at a large curve, like this, small, small, pretty large now, but now our curve is pretty much gone at that point. So this is why velocity increases. As that curve increases, the velocity will also change. So if we go back at some of our older stuff here, take a look at our cambered airfoil. So as the airflow flows over our cambered airfoil, we find out that on the top, the curve is continuous, and so the velocity continues to speed up. As the curve heads back towards 0, the velocity will actually start to slow down. On the bottom, the curve inverts, and therefore the velocity slows down a lot faster. So the velocity isn't always speeding up on the top of an airfoil. Heavy mass curve will cause it to speed up, but as the curve again decreases, that velocity might actually start to slow down, and we're going to talk about that part right now. Here's why. First, we have something called inviscid flow. Inviscid flow means no viscous effect. Such as friction. So what's this going to mean for us? Okay, so if we have an airfoil, let's make a nice little symmetric airfoil here. That's my attempt at a symmetric airfoil right there. Definitely isn't, but nonetheless, we're going to pretend it is. And what happens is that the airflow is going to flow over the top, and it's going to flow over the bottom. Now, what we find here is something called D'Alembert's paradox. I hope I spelled his name correctly. And what his paradox says is that if you have inviscid flow, in other words, there's no skin friction, the airflow over it is going to return to the same pressure at the back because skin friction doesn't exist here. And because of that, you can have lift without drag. Now we know this isn't possible because friction actually exists. But in non-inviscid flow, friction doesn't slow the air. However, we have something that is called viscous flow. And this is what we must think about for real life. There are actually some things where you can approximate viscous flow with inviscid flow approximations. If you get the 301, 302 book, you can read all about that. But for right now, we're just talking about lift. And in viscous flow, we do have viscosity. And therefore friction. And what this friction is going to do is that if we imagine this, if we imagine our airfoil again, we're going to give it a nice big old curve. We talked about how the curve will cause this airflow to speed up. Curve accelerates airflow. However, when we have viscous flow, as the air is pushing across it, you're going to get a viscous effect, which causes friction between layers of air molecules as it goes up. And that viscous airflow is going to cause the air to slow down back in the opposite direction. So viscosity creates a negative acceleration for the airflow. So, when we're looking at this viscous flow, it looks something like this. Where this is the flow velocity. Up here we have V is equal to V infinity. Down here we have V is equal to 0. And this is known as the no-slip condition. Now the reason why this is important is that what it says is that because the flow velocity of the air here is 0, as the air molecule above it tries to push across it, there's going to be friction between those two molecules. And then as the air molecule above that tries to move past it at an even higher speed, it's also going to have friction. And so the slower moving molecules of air below it are going to cause it to want to slow down. And what happens is that at a certain point, the curvature effect from the Coanda effect doesn't accelerate or speed up the flow as much as the viscosity is slowing it down. So, at some point, the curvature doesn't increase U as fast as viscosity decreases U. If we were to write that as an equation, we could say it as we can say, we'll write it in green here, we'll write the velocity due to the curvature is less than hold up. The change of the velocity due to the curvature is less than the change of the velocity due to the viscous effect. Which means our total velocity at some time or actually even better, at some distance down the airfoil X, its change is going to be equivalent to this. So now we have an equation for our velocity. And this explains why velocity does what it does. Now it should be noted, and this is something I'll talk about way later on, but the no slip condition does not apply at hypersonic. At hypersonic conditions, we get things where the heat is so intense on the surface, and it causes this thermal boundary layer, and this thermal boundary layer causes this entropy layer, in fact is what it's called, causes the flow to start to rotate. And because it starts to rotate on top of the surface, the velocity of the particles will actually be greater than 0. And so when we use our no slip condition, we now have an initial displacement condition instead. And this is called our slip condition. And at hypersonic conditions, instead of saying velocity equals 0 at the surface, we just say it equals some initial boundary condition. But then even farther on, the heat gets so intense where even that doesn't work accurately anymore. But that's for a much later time, if I do a video on hypersonics. But this is where we're at so far with velocity. And additionally, because of this same viscous effect, what happens is that if the curve can no longer keep the air down, it's one thing if the velocity starts to decrease. But at a certain point, go ahead and just write it. We've all seen this, where the airflow does something like this, and then we see a picture that looks like this. This is what we call separated airflow. What we get here, what happens is that, at a point, our velocity is too low, and leads to a separation. Actually, before we talk about that, it's very possible for the velocity to be too high. If you have a really, really highly curved airfoil, for example, if the velocity is too fast for the curvature's pressure, you'll get an airflow separation. But what we want to focus on is not this. What do we want to focus on is, what the hell? Hello? Spooky-boo? There we go. Stuff's acting oddly slow right now. I'll do it manually. What we really want to talk about here is that at some point U is too slow, and we're going to go and talk about what happens exactly when it gets too slow. So imagine we have our boundary layer. And we have our boundary layer like this. Speed it up. Too slow is Ash? You can't even play Ash. Anyway, back to important things, Sean. All right. So what's going to happen is that as the velocity here goes 0, we talked about how molecules above it go slower and slower and slower because of friction. So at some point, the molecule here is going to cause the molecule above it to essentially stop as well. Right? So now here we're going to say V layer 1 is going to equal 0. But at some point, V on the second layer is going to equal 0. And that'll cause something on the third layer to equal 0. And as that happens, you wouldn't play her, Sean, but as that happens, you essentially get a buildup of molecules just building up, creating what's essentially about to become a ramp. So, we now have this ramp. So as air behind it starts to move over, it bounces off this ramp, and it ascends to a new velocity. And because of that, it creates this region of separation. Flow gets deflected, and our flow separates. So that's why separation happens, because of that. In hypersonics, this stuff happens too because of waves. So on a supersonic airfoil, you'll have something, you'll get some kind of airfoil that looks like this. This is called the modified double wedge. And what happens is that well, we'll say that we have a nice thing here. This. And then at some point, what'll happen is that you discover the potential that if this pressure right here, when air goes across a shock wave that's oblique, this one here is called oblique. So it's called a fan, an expansion fan. And what happens is that when it goes over an oblique fan, the airflow does something that looks like this. What happens is that when it goes over an oblique fan, the pressure increases significantly. And because that pressure increases significantly, we know that the velocity must also decrease significantly. So if the velocity has decreased significantly, if it comes across a point to where it suffers this viscous effect, viscous separation effect we were just talking about, the flow can separate. Now, this is one of the biggest reasons for the transonic airfoil. Because what would happen was, on an airfoil, some shockwave would form at some point due to hitting critical Mach. And then a little farther down, maybe right here we'll say, we reach our viscous separation condition. This is a shockwave. So, the supercritical comes to achieve is that it offsets how long it takes for the shockwave to occur, so that you can go faster and faster before you start to suffer these high pressure changes and separations. That way your plane can fly in the transonic region, as it'll undergo less drag because of it. You'll have more lift. Your control surfaces will also be more reactive. So that's the point of the supercritical airfoils. Delays the shock formation. Therefore, reduced drag onset. Better stall characteristics. Yeah, transonic region here. Better control surface characteristics. What else did I say there was? That's pretty much the majority of why. Because you have reduced drag, this means better efficiency. There you go. Supersonics. Usually a sharp leading edge. Uses shocks to control flow. And then for subsonic, they use curves to take use of the Coanda Effect. However, because of that, they have lower critical Mach numbers. Okay. So we went over the shockwave influence. Again, critical Machs, it can cause flow separations, and can cause this viscous flow separation. Let's see, we are almost heading to the 2-hour point, which is about where I saw this going. Before we go on to the next part, we're going to go ahead and just take a look at a few images here. So we took a look at our airfoils. There's some more airfoils. Laminar flow, subsonic, nice curve on the top, lesser curve on the bottom, take control of the Coanda Effect. This is called a circular arc. Its actual name is the biconvex. The double wedge airfoil. If you were to cut this in half, and cut this one in half, and then add a flat plate between the two halves that you just split, you would get the modified versions. Clark-wise are very good at the flat bottom to keep the pressure as high as possible on the bottom, and get the pressure as low as possible on the top. Let's go ahead and take a look. So this is an idea of the Coanda Effect. Here you have a velocity. And as it comes out, instead of going straight, because the pressure on top is going to be really high compared to the pressure below, the ambient pressure is going to push it downwards. This is the Coanda Effect. It is due to that suction of curvature. As you see, here's the curvature. There's this pseudo void due to less pressure, and because of that, it's going to have a suction force due to the ambient pressure pushing down. So this is kind of just a recap on those. And then we talked about the shock wave. Here's a plane with a vapor wave, and this vapor wave occurs directly in front of the shock wave. And the reason why is because the airflow has got really, really fast. It's become supersonic, and when it becomes supersonic, the pressure has dropped a lot. And when the pressure drops heavily, the temperature also changes heavily. And so because the temperature has now changed and has actually gone up, the water molecules vaporize and condensate into water, or steam, essentially. And right before it becomes very, very pressurized again, creates this vapor wave, which allows you to see the shock wave. You cannot naturally really see the shock wave with your own eyes. It'll actually be right behind this wave. Let's get right back into it. Get some hydration going. We're on the final stretch now. The next big thing I want to talk about here is vortices. Now, we've all seen wingtip vortices. Here's some wing. And at the end here we have these wingtip vortices. I did it in the wrong direction. The actual direction of a wingtip vortice for a left wing is in this direction. And so it gets larger and larger as it goes. There we go. So that's a wingtip vortice. Now, some planes have what's called a leading edge. An LEX, a leading edge extension. What this extension does is that at the tip here, as it hits an airflow, it'll actually cause another vortice to occur. This vortice will travel down the plane like this. Now, the one I drew here is called an LERX. Leading edge root extension. And vortices play a very pivotal role in lift generation. Now, we've also have things that are called dog teeth. Sometimes we just add a vortex contraption on it as well. So you might see like a little airfoil, like right here. And what'll happen is that as the airflow, here's the airflow flowing here. This airflow is caused by airflow moving across the wing like this. And on the bottom of the wing, it moves in the opposite direction. So what happens is that the airflow on the bottom of the wing goes to the tip of the wing, and then it comes up to the area where it has lower pressure on top of the wing and causes the leading edge, or I mean the tip vortices. This is caused by the air being interfered, causing a vortice. It's essentially a wingtip placed further forward. And then right here we have a vortex generator. What that's going to do is it's going to cause the airflow as it hits across here to create a vortice along the wing like this. So why are vortices something that are used, especially on our fighter jets? Well, the reason why is because if we were to look at a flat plate, the vortex is moving in a flow that looks something like this. Now, it's not the greatest for drag at all. However, at very high speeds, this is good for lift for one reason and one reason only. If you have a plane that doesn't have enough wing surface for its weight, or if you're flying at a very high angle of attack, these vortices will take air that is above and suck it down into its stream. And by sucking the air downwards, it's essentially recreating the Coanda effect, but using vortices down. So by bringing air down, there's more air that's staying next to the surface, and therefore you have the ability to create the pressure and more lift generation. So that is the reason why we use vortices. It brings air back down toward the air surface, so that the Coanda effect can stay useful. So that's that on vortices. Vortices do go in deeper. That's something I'll probably cover later. Next section's really quick. It's about fuselages. Fuselages. Nocelles. Empennages, etc. So, do these have an effect on lift? Simple answer, yes. Yes, it does. So let's take a look at a plane for a second. Typical fuselage look for a airliner. And when you look at it in 2D like this, you can see this is an airfoil. And thus has lift generation. Now, a fuselage that is perfectly symmetrical won't have lift generation if it's, flying at 0 degrees. Talked about this earlier. So with that in mind, we can figure out, okay, cool, if they're essentially 2D layouts, then we can also think about, well, we have aircraft that are called wing body aircrafts, or just a flying wing, right? And the fuselage is just part of that airfoil. But for things like cargo planes, you focus more on your cargo capacity, so they look more like something like this. And because of that, you will get lift generations. There's going to be lift due to the curves here. There's going to be pressure differences because of the curves in the back. And because of that, we get lift generations. Now, on this one particular, pressure in the back will want to cause a moment that goes up, and the front will cause a moment that wants to go down. We can talk about those things later, though. Those aren't really important for us right now. But the simple answer is yes. What is happening here? Alright, the simple... Can I erase? Here we go. Simple answer is that yes, the fuselage will create lift. So will nocelles. Nocelles are like your engine bays. If you have an exterior bay for landing gear, that's the nocelle. The empennage is the back that has the vertical and horizontal stabilizers. So the fuselage absolutely does affect lift. And it follows the same principles as was said before. For fuselages, though, usually they're broken up to stations. In other words, they're nicely broken up into pieces like this. And you just start looking at it as individual pieces. But if we're just looking at lift, it's pretty nice. Alright, so yes, fuselages affect lift. That was pretty simple. Alright, we're just drawing in red. Let's see. That is... Oh, yes. Alright, very, very final thing. We talked about our... Let's see, do we still have it? We do. We talked about this a long time ago. How lift and everything, is a force. So how exactly does it affect our plane? Well, a thing to know about lift is that because it's a force, it has something called a moment arm. Now, if we look at this plane, and we say that right here on this black dot, we're going to call that our CG. And from that CG is going to be our actual weight component. So, if our lift is behind our weight, as you can see it is here, right? Our lift force is in this direction, and it's behind our weight. What's happening is that this lift force will actually cause the plane to turn like this. And because of that, it'll cause the plane to pitch downwards. So, what we know is that we add these rear, the horizontal stabilizer. Now the horizontal stabilizer, if you remember, we talked about a symmetrical airfoil, if it's at a negative angle of attack, will create negative lift. So, if we place those rear horizontal stabilizers at a negative angle of attack, right, here's the airfoil. Here's the airfoil for like our airliner, and then our rear one is actually aimed downward, we'll say. What we end up getting is a lift force from the rear stabilizer that goes down. Again, still normal to the flow of the air. And because this one is also behind the weight, the center of gravity, and it's going downwards, it'll create a pitching of the tail downwards. And the idea of this is to make it so that the pitching of the tail and the pitching of the nose balance out so that you have steady flight. So this is the effect of on plane dynamics. And it's pretty much that simple from a conceptual point of view. Alright. That essentially concludes it here for me today. Thanks for coming in and tuning in. We hit the 2-hour mark just like I wanted to. I'm going to continue going for anyone who's interested in how this stuff works for the automotive industry. So I'm going to go ahead and just do that. Pretty quick, going off some of the old stuff we talked about. So, how about cars? First, let's go ahead and just look at spoilers. Alright, when we have a car, let's go ahead and draw a nice little car here. And then we'll see on the car it has some kind of spoiler. Now if we can go ahead and just take a look at this spoiler right here. Wow, that's what the highlight looks like, huh? Alright. This is our spoiler. So in this spoiler, we actually have a wing. And the wing looks something like this. As you can see, this here is a wing, airfoil, in the opposite direction. I'm going to draw it like this, actually. So what does this mean for us? Well, if you remember, we now have this happening. They use cambers. They use a subsonic airfoil because we don't have any cars, at least the majority of all cars I know of aren't going supersonic. If you were making a supersonic car, sure, you would have a different kind of spoiler. But in terms of cars, you have a spoiler or a wing, and it's just the opposite of what we talked about before. The main curve is on the bottom instead of the top, so that our lift is generated down. Now, when for cars, the lift force is referred to as down force. So that's how spoilers work. It's the same thing as what we've been talking. I'll be right back as I grab my pen. Alright, never happened. So, again, same things we talked about before, spoilers and wings. And then another big thing that cars use is a flat bottom. Flat bottoms and low ride height. So why flat bottoms and low ride heights? Alright, well, I can't, like, select things anymore. It's just very sad. Oh, here we go. OneNote's being slow today. There we go. We got the majority of it. Okay. Draw to go back. So why do cars have flat bottoms and low ride heights? First, we'll talk about the flat bottom. So if you didn't have a flat bottom, you would have essentially an exposed bottom. So the first thing you get from an exposed bottom is, well, cavities. Cavities lead to drag. Cavities also lead to rotational flow. Rotational flow leads to a lower velocity. Lower velocity means higher pressure. Higher pressure means less downforce. So, essentially what happens here is that the flow, let's draw the ground real quick. Flow's going to go under. If the flow starts to rotate because it's hitting off things like exposed engine parts, or just a rough undersurface from manufacturing of the structure, it'll lower the velocity because the flow will start to hit off things, and if it hits off things, its velocity is no longer streamlined like this. It's no longer straight, which means not all of its velocity is in the parallel direction. Therefore, you have a lower velocity, which means the pressure is higher. And if the pressure is higher here, that means you have less downforce. Just remember, for a car, we want high pressure above low pressure below. Now, why do we want a low ride height? We want a low ride height because of Bernoulli's equation. I'm sorry. Not Bernoulli. Bernoulli is not the one I want here. What I want here is something called the Venturi equation, or the Venturi effect. Now, the Venturi effect says that, well, the Venturi effect is essentially a conservation of mass. So, if we have a pipe that does something like this, mass flow rate here must be the same as the mass flow rate here, which means the mass flow rate here must also be the same. So from the Venturi effect, we find out that if the mass is the same, something has to change. We describe M flow rate as merely a mass per second. We also have the volume flow rate. And our volume flow rate is meters cubed per second. Now, our flow rate here is going to be equal to our area times the velocity. Right? That way we have meters squared times meters per second. That gives us our mass flow rate. So our volume flow rate. Our mass flow rate must be meters per second, or mass per second, right? Since we're actually using real terms here, we'll go ahead and change this to kilograms. Okay. So we already know we have meters squared. It's meters per second. Now we want to get rid of the meters squared meters while also adding weight. Okay. What if we try multiplying it by density? Density, rho, is mass over volume. So, that'd be kilograms over meters cubed, which would give us kilograms per second. So from that, we find out that our mass flow rate is equal to Q rho, which is going to be equal to rho VA, and this is a constant. So, with that in mind, that must mean that if our density is staying the same, right, incompressible flow, then if we reduce our area here, and we say that A1 is equal to A3, which is more than A2, then if A2 goes down, in order for this to be constant, the velocity must go up. So the Venturi effect says that as you reduce the amount of area your mass has to go through, it will speed up in order to follow the conservation of mass. So, by lowering the ride height, you are reducing that area, therefore the flow must go faster. So let's go and write this. Why is it in red? There we go. Come on, window. There we go. So lower ride height leads to less area under car for the flow to traverse. Which then leads to an increase in velocity. Increased velocity leads to lower pressure. Lower pressure leads to more downforce. So that's the main stuff behind cars. Wings and flat bottoms and lower ride height. Now there's also things with internal flows and everything, which also lead to the same kind of idea. But we're not going to go into that. We're going to go ahead and end this here. Alright, thanks everyone for watching. Hope this was useful, enjoyable, and I'll have this uploaded on the Confluence. And I'll catch you all next time. Bye-bye.